Welcome to the Smart Aerialists podcast. I'm Ophelia, your host, an aerial coach, movement specialist, and lifelong performer. This podcast is for aerialists who want to train smarter, move better, and build strength and flexibility in a sustainable way. We'll dive into the science of aerial training, injury prevention, and long-term progress so you can keep growing without burnout. Whether you're just starting out or refining your craft, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. All right, welcome team to another episode of the Smart Aerialist podcast with your host Ophelia, me, your aerial coach with over 30 years of experience in the circus and 10 years of experience coaching. Today, we are going to discuss what is progressive overload and how you can apply it in your aerial training skills. Topics we are going to approach is first discuss what is progressive overload, how do we safely apply into our aerial training, how do we balance overload with recovery, how do we apply progressive overload in terms of skill development, how do we avoid plateaus and injury, and just overall how we can combine this into our overall holistic training strategies. Let's dive in. So when we discuss progressive overload, we discuss a concept that is mostly used a lot in strength training or bodybuilding. Right? When you hear progressive overload, very often it is related to increasing the amount of repetition, decreasing the amount of rest that you have between sets, and increasing the amount of weight that you put on your barbell or the weights of your dumbbells. Now, obviously, this can be applied in terms of aerial training too, and you probably have noticed as well that you have applied progressive overload in your training by being able to hang on to your apparatus a little bit longer, being able to hold your core exercise a little bit longer, and so on. This is how we apply a bit more progressive overload into aerial training. What progressive overload does in general, it helps you build a bit more resilience, stamina, and also muscle growth that is necessary for your own training. Especially as an aerialist, we still need to build not only the foundation, the skills, but we also need adaptation in our body to keep leveling up. In order for you to progress, you need to keep being challenged beyond your current capacity. And this is how we work on progressive overload. Now, something that's important on understanding progressive overload is that we always expect it to go quite quickly or grow quite fast. Unfortunately, what I'm going to tell you is that progressive overload is not meant to be pushed too far too quickly, because that's going to be a bit of an issue with your recovery, and therefore you might be getting more injured instead of actually progressing. I want to make sure you understand that progressive overload can be in 1 second less rest or a very small amount of extra reps. This is done over the course of 12 weeks to 6 months to a year, depending on what goal you are having. This is very important to understand so you don't overtrain and you don't get overuse injuries in the long term. So how do we apply that in terms of our aerial training? Well, first of all, that doesn't mean you need to add classes. No, to the contrary. Just start thinking more in terms of during your conditioning and adding a couple of reps in your conditioning exercises. So this can be done quite easily when you move on to your conditioning part of your class, for example. If you start doing shrugs or straddle, maybe you start adding a couple more shrugs, or maybe you do one more straddle, or maybe hold your straddle negative invert a little bit longer, and this is how we can apply progressive overload in our conditioning. In terms of warm-up, how you can apply progressive overload in your training is a little bit more complicated, because obviously you are bound to a syllabus that we coaches have to teach throughout our classes. Therefore, it's not like you can just follow and do extra reps if it's part of a whole warm-up that you do together. For example, my warm-up is done as a form of exercise to music, and we do it on the beat, and in a sense, you might not be able to do an extra rep, so take less rest. Where you can see that you are applying progressive overload is when you struggle a little bit less in between your warm-up elements, and also that you are able to go for the more advanced versions of the warm-up elements. You can also do extra core elements of your warm-up outside your classes to increase your progressive overload of these particular elements. And I do recommend that you do that, especially for the exercises that you are struggling with. So for example, I have quite a few conditioning routines on my YouTube channel. I have an entire conditioning program for beginner aerialists for that reason, because we apply progressive overload over the course of 8 weeks. So in the Starter Toolkit, which is in my app, the Aerialist Aerial Performance Lab, but also you can have it separately. The Aerialist Starter Toolkit, the way I designed it, is very much just keeping in line with a warm-up that I teach in my classes, conditioning that I teach in my classes, that are composed of workouts that last about 10 minutes to 20 minutes. The first few weeks that we will do this will be 10 minutes. The first few weeks that we are going towards at the end will be a longer workout. It's not just a progressive overload that I add with time. It is a progressive overload with also making the students start with the elements of the warm-up separately. For example, doing a core exercise, doing 10 repetitions of that core exercise, and do it for 3 sets and taking a little break in between, and then moving on to the other exercise. The week after, we will start supersetting or tri-setting 2 or 3 exercises together. So this way you do not take a break between 2 or 3 elements of your conditioning exercises. And towards the end, we might be doing a full circuit the same way I would teach my full in a warm-up class of an aerial hoop, for example. But on top of that, I add some stronger and more difficult elements, and we also make the workout slightly longer. Towards the end, in the program, the Aerialist Starter Toolkit, I go so hard on my students because we add also elements of what we call the need. So the element of is an element of having the full circuit that you have to complete in a certain amount of time, and you have to repeat the circuit as many rounds as possible. You have a timer that will tell you you have to do all these elements, 10 elements of crunches, 10 elements of leg lift, 10 elements of this. You need to do this as many rounds as possible in a space of 10 minutes. So we go from separating each exercise to supersetting each exercise to circuit the exercises to completing 3 to 4 rounds of these exercises in a time frame that is limited. That's your AMRAP. At the end, we even introduce you to what we call, which is an every minute on the minute. Every minute on the minute, you are going to try and complete a certain amount of exercise, 20 crunches in under a minute. Then after the next minute, you're going to do another exercise. So every minute on the minute, we're moving onto an exercise, and it is going to be hard, and it's going to require quite a lot of stamina for you to complete. So this is how I design as a coach when I want people to implement progressive overload into their routine to become stronger and to see themselves getting a little bit more progress outside the aerial classes. And I have explained to you the principle of progressive overload in terms of conditioning and strength. So we discuss on the apparatus how you can apply that, and we discuss as well off the apparatus how you can train yourself to implement progressive overload. You can also, obviously, what I've just discussed is one part of training as a coach that I recommend in terms of conditioning. There is also the elements of you going to an actual gym and strength training, which is, again, I will not keep on bragging about, because strength training really transforms the way you train aerial. Just a reminder that I will never stop telling you to go strength train at the gym for your aerial practice. Super beneficial. But for your progressive overload, it's going to be the same thing. So if you do strength training, you are also going to start applying your progressive overload in your programs. And the same I apply as a coach in the program that I have designed that you can do at the gym in Aerial Performance Lab. I have an invert program that is specifically for people to try and build the strength on an invert, and we do add progressive overload over the course, again, of 6 to 8 weeks. The exercises change slightly, but most of the time what is important as well is in progressive overload is repetition. So you can make the exercises slightly more advanced, but what I'm talking about exercises more advanced is, for example, doing kneeling press-ups moving on to regular press-ups. That's a progressive overload, but the compound of the biomechanics is still the same, which is quite important for you to find progress in your practice. You don't want to randomly change the exercise every single week. You want to feel yourself progressing through the same exercise week in, week out. I think that's important for you to understand that as well, which can feel a bit tedious and boring, but it's actually quite important for you in order to track your progress. So we're going to do the same at the gym. If you start lifting weights, then if you have a program that is specific to your aerial skills that you want to build as well, like I explained, I am making programs for my online community, which is one, we're going to do an invert to really build that invert strength. So working on the lats, working on the core compression, working on the hip strength, and making also some maintenance element, which are a little bit easier in terms of workouts, but they are still good to help maintain your strength as an aerialist, develop it. And those elements of workouts also have some of the conditioning exercises as a finisher. And when we have this finisher, it will also increase in terms of maybe time, in terms of reps, in terms of a rest in between your sets. So this is how I design as well. When you do at the gym, you'll do your strength and then you'll add on a little conditioning. Yes, we're obviously not talking about the flexibility, but flexibility will also be about the same. You're going to start stretching a little bit longer. You're going to start adding longer stretches, and you are going to start adding maybe loaded stretches as well. This is a little bit complicated, right? Because we feel progressive overload will take more time at the gym and it will take more time away from your classes. And it might. And this is the reality of it. If you want to really build your skills, you have to start strategizing your training outside the classes. And this might need you to drop maybe a class so you can actually work on a specific goal. If you really struggle with wanting to drop some of the classes, just start really thinking of how much faster you will be able to progress when you start implementing a really good rehab strategy, really good flexibility strategy, a really good strength and conditioning strategy outside your classes. When you practice those elements outside your classes, it's when skills truly unlock during your classes. It's not during the classes they'll unlock. Some of them might, but having a really strong strategy with a progressive overload implemented into it, it will really give you that sensation that the skills are going to unlock a lot faster. Trust me on that. Also, I know that if you do feel a little bit disheartened with the fact that you need to start training a little bit more outside the classes instead of constantly in the classes, my recommendation is to start with baselines. For example, how long can you hold a dead hang with maybe a knee tuck or leg raises? How long are you able to do a one single arm hang? So on. How many pull-ups, how many press-ups, how many... So you start with that baseline. And it's all about trying to increase that baseline. So your flexibility, your straddles, your pull-ups, your grip strength. Documenting your starting point is so important for you to actually see what progressive overload can do to you. It starts with a small thing. And the second element that you need to get after this is increasing the intensity gradually. Now, as a coach, my job is to try and make sure that you reach your goal obviously as quickly and as sustainably as possible. So my job is to make sure I design programs that are effective. When you are doing this by yourself, you might be asking your coach if you can get some advice on what element you need to work on in particular, and if they recommend some exercises, and then start with that. Start with just those simple exercises that are recommended. Because yes, a workout at the gym will easily last 45 minutes to an hour. Most of my students or my clients will do about 2 to 3 workouts a week. They'll do a bit of flexibility practice and they'll go to about 2 or 3 aerial classes a week on average, more or less. So if you're not used to doing any workouts at all, you need to actually start small. Maybe you would start with something like I've just talked about, the Aerialist Starter Toolkit, which will just constitute your extra 10, 15 or 20 minutes of conditioning that you'll try and practice maybe 2 or 3 times per week. And then you start gradually increasing or changing your strategy into your training habits. It is important to increase gradually, because otherwise you are again going to end up with overuse injuries or any other kind of burnout if you push too hard too quickly. And then obviously telling ways of skill progression in your progressive overload is when you do a move and you move on to the more advanced version of that move. When I teach a class, when I design my aerial classes, I try and actually avoid giving a new syllabus for 6 to 8 weeks. This means that we are going to work on about 3 to 4 different combos that I'll be teaching over the course of 2 weeks at a time. So one combo first couple of weeks, another combo the other couple of weeks, and I will move on to about 3 to 4 combos like this, which are working on similar skills, similar requirements of strength, similar requirements of stamina. And this way, my warm-up would be the same with obviously progressive overload, and the conditioning would be the same. This allows my students to build up progressive overload. And in my combos on top of this, I will also have a more friendly, beginner-friendly version of moves and a more advanced version of moves. So this way, when my students come from week 1 to week 8 regularly and consistently to my classes, they'll be able not only to work their strength and conditioning capacity, they'll also be able to see if they can move on to the more beginner-friendly skill to the more advanced skill throughout. And towards the end of the 8 weeks, we pull those combos together into an entire flow. Every week, I will still also give the opportunity for those who come to week 1 and 2 to keep practicing week 1 and 2 in week 3, 4, and so on. So this way, we're still also learning this sort of cognitive enhancement capacity as well in my classes. And this is how you should also try and make your training. Try and think of how much more flow you get out of the same moves, how much more ease you get into the poses. And this is how also you can increase that progressive overload. Now, it's important to balance this overload with your recovery strategy as well. Generally, in any overload programming, we do an overload programming over the course of 6 to 12 weeks. But if we do 6 weeks, we try and take a deload phase, which means we reduce the training intensity for about a week. For those who have flexibility and mobility goals, sometimes I deload for more than 1 week. Sometimes I deload for 2 weeks. Also, it'd be very telling to see if you have overtrained, and you would probably have to wait until you feel a bit better. Overtraining, you are going to start feeling cranky, tired, disconnected with your practice, and sore. So keep an eye on the signs for that. I have more resources on this. I have another episode on burnout and overtraining, signs of overtraining. But also just really think that rest is a really important part of your progress as well. So it's important to incorporate those rest days into your practice. Even if you do some holistic movement, sometimes it's good to still do 1 day of completely resting. Deload phases every 6 weeks. And obviously stay and listen to your body. So explain if you feel the signs of overtraining, then step back and prioritize your recovery. So we've discussed how you can apply this through your warm-up, through your conditioning, and even through your skills. Again, when you want to start flowing the skills and seeing if your progressive overload is paying off, you can start increasing the complexity of your exercises over time, increasing the speed of your transition, for example, adding a spin or rotation to your static holds and your move, working on longer sequences, which is why I was explaining I do different combos that we then combine all together into a long flow. This is the way for people to actually see themselves progress. And trust me, most of my students that have been training with me since I've started teaching, they progress very fast. If they come consistently in a year or 2, most of my students are able to become teachers, which is something that I'm very proud of, actually. So really think about this as well. Really think about how repetition and mastering those basics and really implementing progressive overload, not only in just the warm-up, your conditioning, your strength training, but also in the way you apply your skills. So from beginners to advanced, your transition, your flow, and the way you are able to hold yourself up in the air. All right, let's finish with discussing how to avoid the plateaus and your injuries. We discussed the signs of overtraining, but also there will be plateaus, and this is why we need to implement a deload phase after 6 weeks. Because when you start overtraining, your body is going to start shutting down. You're going to have mental burnout. Like I said, you're going to start feeling disconnected from your practice. You are going to actually start seeing yourself dropping in performance. So when we progressive overload and you keep increasing, there is one point your body just can't take it anymore, and it's actually going to go way down. And this is not just about training. Sometimes it's about also personal life events and other kind of events that might be happening, higher stress levels at work and so on, that really will impact how your training is going to go. So really stay in tune with that, noticing the signs, and make sure that you understand as well that pulling back and sometimes just taking a step back and resting and reassessing your strategy when you plateau. Sometimes plateauing doesn't mean that you're not doing the right thing, but you might need to reassess your strategy as well. So make sure you get a coach for that. All right. I hope you'd find this really helpful in ways for you to understand how to train in a smarter way when you do aerial training and to see yourself progress a little bit faster. Again, if you want to check out the Aerial Performance Lab, everything will be in the show notes, and you also will have access. There is the blog, so everything that I have discussed today will be also put into a blog. So don't forget to subscribe, share this to someone who needs to hear advice like this one, and also let me know what you think about this podcast and what else would you like me to discuss in terms of aerial training, the science behind everything, the biomechanics, and even the mental aspects of aerial training. I want to thank you for coming here today and listening to this, watching this, and I wish you a beautiful day wherever you are. Do let me know what you thought about it, and make sure you comment, and I will see you maybe in Aerial Performance Lab or in the next episode. Bye. I also want to remind you that there is a treasure trove of free content that you can access and I create for you. First of all, with every episode, you will see there are show notes where you can access the block that relate to this episode. The block dives a little bit deeper into details and also provide added references for you, some extra reading and some science papers that have inspired those episodes and those blogs. Second of all, you can also check out my YouTube channel where you will find a lot of workouts and flexibility, conditioning and strength exercises that are suited for aerialists in particular, but just not aerialists as well. And finally, don't forget to check out my app and the Aerialist Performance Lab.